I am Nikhil Hogan. My guest today is Professor Job IJzerman, and he teaches at the Conservatorium van Amsterdam. He is known for his book Harmony, Counterpoint, Partimento, published by Oxford University Press in 2018, a very popular book. So, Professor IJzerman, welcome to the Nikhil Hogan Show.
Thank you, Nikhil, and thanks for your invitation.
Let me start off with your background. Could you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yes. Now, I started playing piano when I was 8 years old or so, and I never had the intention to make music of my profession. But when I was studying pedagogy at the university, from one day on the other, I decided to change my study and starting a music study. I was completely ignorant. I had to go to the telephone box on the street to find out if the city where I was studying had a conservatory. And indeed. So I phoned them and asked if I could play for them. And yes, that was okay. Within 1 week, I could do a little audition and I could start with the studies. It was very easy in that time. But I remember that my fellow students all were very aware of the teachers they wanted to study with, but I didn't know all of them. So I was completely ignorant, and then I started my music career in that way.
Did you improvise and compose growing up, or were you trained to play repertoire?
Most of all the latter. But I improvised a little bit and I played some little tunes. I accompanied them. So I could more or less play on the piano just what came into my mind. But mostly I was trained in playing the repertoire.
Right. And did you have any experience with thoroughbass, basso continuo?
No, not at all, because that wasn't the time. I started my studies in 1974, so that was a long time ago. And of course, basso continuo was well known, but specifically for organ and harpsichord players. And nobody ever heard of partimento. That came much, much later.
Now, you speak of 2007 being introduced to Robert Gjerdingen's work. He visited and gave a presentation.
Actually, that was the first time that I have ever encountered partimento. Just 1 year later, I started to read his book, Music in the Galant Style. And that was actually the start of really thinking in terms of partimento and reform of teaching harmony and counterpoint at the conservatory. Bob Gjerdingen came right on the right time, because I was quite skeptical. I became more and more skeptical about teaching harmony in the traditional way. I was using the book of Altwell and Schechter, Harmony and Voice Leading, and that's really a good book. But I had the idea that students didn't pick up the essence of everything. And if you allow me, I can
please go ahead.
Explain that
Yes.
by means of two anecdotes. One was I remember a program that we had on the Conservatorium of Amsterdam is called Analysis and Performance. And then an analysis teacher and an instrumental teacher came together and taught in one group a couple of students about one particular piece. And I remember that one of my colleagues had such a class with a world-famous cellist, at least world-famous in the Netherlands, and they talked about a Bach suite. And one of the students played, I don't know, the second one or so, and he actually didn't know what to do with that piece. And my colleague started to talk about the harmonic underlayment of that suite, of that piece. But the cello player interrupted him and said, "Yeah, we cellists never think in terms of harmony."
Oh, wow.
Whereupon my colleague replied, "Yes, I can hear that." Now, before you conclude that all cello players are stupid, of course, not at all.
No, not at all. No.
My wife is cellist and she's much smarter than me. But
all wives are.
Yes, that's true. But that made me think, perhaps do we need as theory teachers to look through the mirror and ask ourselves the question, what are we doing wrong that even a famous cellist doesn't use the knowledge that we deliver to them? So that actually that was far before 2007 when I met Bob for the first time.
And that was a world class player.
Absolutely, yeah, and he was specialized in early music performance, and he was really aware of what he was doing. But harmony didn't play a big role in his way of thinking. But another thing later was when I was the head of the theory department in Amsterdam, and I had an office hour for students, and they came to me with all sorts of difficulties, problems, etc., and I could help them. At least I tried. And once a girl came to me, a second-year student, and she told me, Job, I don't understand anything of harmony. And I looked in her files, and I discovered that she had good grades, and she passed her first year exam without any problem, and I confronted her with that. And she said, yes, but I really don't know what I'm doing. I'm able to make some little puzzles, but when my teacher is going to the piano and plays just what I wrote down, then when he stopped the harmonic phrase, the sound was immediately gone. So there was no memory, no meaningful idea of what she was doing actually. So these two anecdotes perhaps explain why I.
And she was a good student, right? You're saying
she was a good student, yes, and very reliable, and she really wanted to learn, but she didn't know what to do with that.
Is that around the time that you had that switch? You were saying, right?
Now that was before Gjerdingen came, and then he started to introduce partimento pedagogy. And for me, that was a sort of bomb that was dropped down. So actually, the partimenti that he introduced were so clear, and you looked at the bass, and it was as if the bass was speaking to you. And of course, I was a teacher, and another question was, of course, how students would react on that. But actually, the essence of it was not about thinking in choices of chords or so, but in thinking in terms of patterns. And I wrote in the preface of my book, it was a sort of opposition between a holistic approach in terms of partimento and Gjerdingen versus a more atomic approach. From chord to chord to chord to chord. Gjerdingen himself, in his last book, Child Composers, he calls that the idiom approach or method, and the grammatical method, or the open choice method. And the way how little children, for instance, acquire language is much more the idiom approach than the open choice. So they don't think in terms of grammar or the choice of words, but they just imitate their parents. And actually that is also, I think, the point in partimento teaching. You learn patterns and you imitate them.
So what steps did you then take to put this into practice?
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, that I didn't really immediately have an idea about how to do that. But I started to make just some exercises for my first and second year students to experiment with that, more pattern-based than just the grammar of chords. And it took actually years, or a couple of years, before I really got the idea of building a whole method on that. And in that time also Giorgio Sanguinetti came with his book The Art of Partimento, which of course also helped to form my ideas. And when I go back in history, I think in 2013 or so, I got a scholarship by the Dutch government of education to perform some research on schemas. That was my own choice, and I posed myself the question: if we take the schemata of Bob Gjerdingen, can we also apply that in other styles than just the galant style?
Yes, and that's a question that everyone asks, basically.
Yeah, the point is that our task, our teaching task is not just only focusing on one style, but covering at least the whole classic romantic period.
The quote-unquote common practice.
Yes, the common practice period, yes. And so I started some research in Beethoven, Schubert Schumann. And what I found actually was a lot of galant schemata, so to speak, but not galant anymore, but transformed into a new style. Yeah? So the Romanesca in a Beethoven style, or the Prenner in Schumann. And like that, also Schubert, in the music of Schubert, you can find a lot of those schemas, but transformed and more up to date to the own early Romantic language. So for me, that was a sign that I could go on with starting actually to form a method, to design a method which was based on the common practice period, like most harmony books do actually. And I started with Corelli and I ended with Brahms and Tchaikovsky. And of course, there is also a lot of fragments in those compositions that cannot be seen as galant schemata. That would be really naive to think that. But you can speak of harmony in Tchaikovsky or in Brahms or in Beethoven or in whatever composer in terms of patterns. So just to take out the more holistic approach from partimento teaching.
How is the reception of this method? Were you actively using it with your students this whole time from 2007 to 2015?
No, I started actually designing the methods, I think 2014, 2015. And actually my students, I think at least, that they responded well on that new approach. Of course, always a bit difficult because they never knew the other method. So I knew the old-fashioned method, but they didn't. And I was just their first teacher in that subject. And now even worse, we always have a lot of students from foreign countries who already did harmony and analysis on other conservatories in Spain, France, Japan, etc. And they
were they shocked? Were they shocked at this?
No, yes, indeed. At the start, yes. And their first response was always, yes, but my teacher in Spain or wherever did it differently.
Yeah.
My response was always, yes, but now you're in Amsterdam. So end of the discussion. Wonderfully, they accepted that actually. And but the point, and that brings me a little bit to the essence of what I did. The point is that one point of my skepsis was that music theory, at least in my mind, was always something for keyboard players. And as a theory teacher, you always play on the piano and you play your Haydn or Beethoven symphonies on the piano, and you expect the students to play their exercises in harmony classes on the piano, even though we all know that not everybody is playing piano so well. If, let's say, in the most current methods, lesson 1, section 1, week 1 is the triad in a 4-part setting. I remember my own piano studies in the time, and we started with that. And of course, I could play those chords without any problem. But I always had I thought, at least in the beginning, what's the meaning of this here? How can I connect it with my beautiful Beethoven sonata that I was studying? Yeah? And because it is not about, it's in chorales of Bach, yes, indeed, but not in Beethoven, or at least not so often. So I always felt a sort of big misunderstanding with my students, and I thought that now, at that time I was working quite often with singing students, and I knew that they couldn't play the piano, but they could sing. So I thought, let me design exercises in which they could sing it. Yeah. And so let's not start with a chord in 4-part setting, but let's just start with a scale or so. For instance, just to give an example. Now, if you do that in canon, then you could, for instance, do something like this here. Etc. Then one is starting a little bit later than the other, and then you get something like counterpoint or harmony. You get things like this. And when we started to sing these little exercises, there was immediately a sort of experience of music performance. So when I played it on my keyboard, it is almost nothing. But when you sing it and listen to the intonation, etc., then actually everybody enjoys it. That is always my experience, singers or not. And so that became the start of my very method. So what I was playing was the first exercise of my whole workbook.
Did you take your partimento exercises from Fenaroli or Furno or Durante, of that sort? And the singing exercises, were they solfeggi or just things that you composed that were related to partimento?
All of them. If you look at my workbook, then you see that there are a lot of exercises that are based on partimenti. Often arrangements of them, because in the beginning, of course, partimenti are too difficult to start with. But I can give you one of the first exercises that my students do after 3 weeks of lesson, so really early in their in the method. And but just to finish the answer on your question, so there are partimenti or arrangements of them. There are self-made exercises, but in line with those partimenti. And there are also arrangements of well-known compositions. Made ready for exercises in 2 parts or 3 parts or 4 parts or whatever. But just to continue with my example of singing a scale, a little bit more complex exercise would be to not sing the scale in parallel thirds or in 6, but with an alternation of thirds and 6, and then you get something like this here. Etc.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And there are so many pieces that yes, sure. But there are so many pieces that actually are based on that very simple procedure. One of the first exercises that I made based on that 3/6 progression, as I call it, is a partimento by Francesco Durante. He was living at the time of Johann Sebastian Bach. And I arrange it a little bit because it's a very, very long partimento, but it starts like a Vivaldi concerto. So that's the beginning. And I advise my students just to keep it in octaves. So only the bass was given. And now a solo episode comes in. Etc.
Oh, and wonderful.
Use a little bit later. Now, I think this is really wonderful music. And I associate it with a Vivaldi concerto or so. But it only takes a 3/6 progression, nothing more than that.
Let me ask you a question related to the method and your book. Is it designed for 4 years of undergraduate study? So if you, or is it maybe 2 years, 1 year? What's the time frame of your method?
Yeah, I made it with the 4 semester structure as we have in the 2 years. Actually, I've divided the book in 2 parts, chapters 1 to 5 and 6 to 9. And 1 to 5 is for the first year and 6 to 9 is for the second year. But that is just based on our own program. I can imagine that you can do it much quicker in 1 year, but of course then you need more time. But so just an undergraduate course of harmony analysis.
You've been teaching students in the older method, and now you're using your new method. What's the difference between a student who has gone through the old method after 2 years of theory classes versus today when you're using your book and your new method after they complete the 2 years?
Yeah. Now, of course, you always have good and you have less good students. So students who have difficulties with music theory in general, and of course, it's also a matter of interest. So it's always difficult to make a comparison in general. But my experience is that my students now do much better exercises that always make a good link to real music. And what I remember from my earlier, old-fashioned method with Roman numerals, degrees, and chord choice, etc., is that I always felt a big trouble with actually the majority of my students. And I had the idea that I sometimes felt a little bit as a dentist who was indicating parallel fifths or so. Yeah? And it took so much time at the piano with all those students, and they make mistake after mistake after mistake, even when they tried their best. And now I have much more the idea that my students, it almost seems now a bit of a commercial, but when they do an exercise, each exercise gets its own instruction. But I have the feeling that most of the students know what they are doing, and they also know what they should do. For instance, when they see a scale going up in the bass or so, or then they know, no, I can apply a 3/6 progression. I can make it in different ways, actually. I can perhaps apply the rule of the octave or, several possibilities. But then they know what to do for the whole passage. And now each chapter, each section deals with one specific problem. And for instance, if they see a bass with tight bass notes, then they know that one specific realization should be required. So it's much more a sort of idea of stimulus and response, you might say. So they see something, the bass or sometimes the melody is speaking to them, and of course they also need a little help by me or by the instructions in the book. But then they know, oh yeah, this is the way how to do it. And ideally speaking, they are able to perform that with their own instruments. Now I have some classes with wind instrument players, trombone, and but also oboe or clarinet. And so we can make some ensembles. And now, of course, nowadays with the Corona crisis, everything is online, and that's a difficulty. But let's hope that somewhere everything will be solved. But then, we play together in the class. Not always, because it takes some time. But they can use their own instrument or they sing. And there is some sort of joy of music making.
That's why I believe that there's so much interest and so much excitement around these old methods. You were mentioning that you were talking about the older theory. Ironically, that's the new theory, right? And we're actually going back in time to the even older, but the way that historically they would have used that. I want to ask you, do you have an example of a student who may have come in with, they might have studied harmony in a completely different way and they were shocked, but then after trying this, they are a complete convert?
Yes, there are, of course. Difficult to give an example, but what I said, some were shocked at the very beginning. That was what now comes into my mind. I had a discussion with one of those students, and he or she, I've forgotten, told me, yes, but my teacher in Sweden or whatever told me this and that. And now you are going to tell me I have to do it in this way or that way, in another way. And I asked him or her, yes, but did you understand it in your previous life? No, not at all. And do you understand what we are doing? Yes. Okay.
That is so funny. Now, what about the faculty now? So that's the students, but how has the reception of your book and the method been with your peers? Because obviously this is very new in terms of pedagogy in the modern age. So how have they taken to your new methods?
Yes, that's a difficult question because now, first of all, I have to say that I didn't want to be provocative in any way, but I just wanted to reform and to make things better. But I also know that it is a very long path to convince your colleagues, and actually I don't want to convince them myself. Of course, I did a presentation at the Conservatory when my book just came out. And I was very glad to see a lot of my colleagues, and they reacted enthusiastically. And so the reactions were very positive. But if I now look at my colleagues, I don't think that many of them are using my method. I know at least one who is really following that. That was a colleague who helped me a lot also with writing the book. So that was quite logical that he would also use that. But others, not so much at the very moment. And perhaps they will do or perhaps not.
I'll call you again next year, and then I'm going to ask you the same question. See if there's a big difference.
Yeah. Anyway, but for me, that's not a big deal. So everybody should do what he or she thinks is best. And it's also a matter of your own experience, of course. And when you are already familiar with the method for 10 or 15 years or so, or 20 years, then I can fully understand that you don't immediately change everything because there's someone who is telling a new story. So I'm quite tolerant, I must say, in that. So I don't expect anyone to follow it. But of course, I'm really glad if I hear.
But now that's the next question. Do you receive emails from professors around the world who have read your book, and what did they say?
Yeah, when the book still wasn't published, I got a number of emails from all over the world. I remember an email by one of my colleagues, a colleague in Iran. Now, you don't expect that, of course.
Right.
And he was so well educated, and he said so many wise words about the things that I was thinking about already years. And I thought, what a fine colleague was that. And he told me that he was really, when the book was published, he would immediately advise his students to buy it, and he would take it as the material for his lessons. So from Iran, and also from Japan, and from the United States. In the Netherlands, we have an annual conference, and I learned that just a number of teachers from other conservatories in other towns than Amsterdam are using the book now, and are very enthusiastic. On one conservatory, it is the general material for for all the teachers. But I cannot say that there was a very big number of reactions from the Netherlands, actually. It's a bit strange enough, but most reactions came from outside our country. but that has a long history, because you have to know that when you are a teacher in music theory at a Dutch institution, you really need to teach. And there's almost no time for doing research, reading your literature, etc., etc. So I can at least partly understand that. Yes, yeah.
Are you friends with? I'm a fan of a great improviser, Karst de Jong.
Yes.
Do you know him well? And because he's Dutch, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Did he look over your work as well? Because he's known for being a well-known improviser.
That's true. Yeah. Yes, he knows my book, and he was a very fine colleague of mine, because he also was teaching in Amsterdam, and I know him also from The Hague, where he is teaching at this very moment now. And we talked a lot. We were in a sort of research group when I told you about my scholarship, and at the same time he was also working on a sort of method for improvisation, and we formed a group together with different people who were doing research at the same time. So it was really wonderful, and we talked a lot about his research and mine. So yes, indeed, I know him very well.
And Peter van Toor, is he Dutch? Is Peter van Toor Dutch?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, great. He's also really a fine scholar on partimento, and do you collaborate with him as well?
No, I know him quite well, and we have met several times, and I know that he also knows my book, and I know his book, of course, and there is a sort of international scene, you might say, of teachers, researchers who are all working on partimento, solfeggio, like Giorgio Sanguinetti already mentioned him before, and Bob Gjerdingen, I think he was the initiator of the whole scene. Yes, indeed. Yeah, Peter is.
I'm thrilled. Okay. So he wrote a book on counterpoint. I want to ask you. Traditionally, in universities, harmony and counterpoint are separated, and in counterpoint, Fuchs is very popular, and there's different ways to teach both subjects. In your book, harmony and counterpoint are both in the title. When you teach, do you have it all in one class, or do you separate learning counterpoint, doing species on its own as a separate subject?
Now, we have two different counterpoint subjects separated from everything else, and that is a counterpoint in Renaissance style and in Baroque style. And I'm doing quite a lot of lessons in Renaissance style, and that is different from what I'm describing in my book. But that is not so much species counterpoint, but I try to approach it in a very historical way, in which in the pre-Fuchs methods, you might say, more Zarlino, and so that is a different discipline, you might say. There are some historically based books, for instance, Johannes Menke from the Schola Cantorum Basiliensis. I think he's teaching now in Freiburg. But he wrote a very nice book about Renaissance counterpoint. And it was published just a few years ago, I think in 2015 or so. And I've read the book, I think 3 years ago. And to my surprise, actually, what he's describing in that book was almost actually the same that I was already teaching for years and years. So that was really a wonderful. But he gave much more profound information and than I did. I knew. So that was really an enrichment of my own lessons. Renaissance style counterpoint. Of course, differs from 18th century harmony and counterpoint. But I have to say that for writing the book, I needed all my skills in counterpoint for showing the way how 18th century composers were working. Because I think that the statement that the music of Mozart is purely homophonic or mainly harmonic is not right. There's always a mixture of contrapuntal techniques together with more harmonic ones. So the more linear and the vertical combined.
If somebody is interested in learning music of the common practice era, should they be acquainted with Renaissance counterpoint?
Yes, I think yes. Now, let's see. At least I don't want to say that they first have to do a course in Renaissance counterpoint. That would go too far, I think. But I think that's one of the main issues in my book, that I try to show them that a lot of the phrases that you can see in Mozart sonatas or symphonies are based on contrapuntal aspects like dissonant treatment and the like, and also thinking in terms of different voices. And there are so many passages in Mozart sonatas that are, of course, you can always give them Roman numerals, etc., but it doesn't become satisfactory by doing that.
There is the Italian partimento, I guess with a capital P. But partimento itself, I mean, Handel composed partimenti for Princess Anne, and the Langlois manuscript is considered partimento with small p.
Sure.
Could you explain to my listeners what's the difference between partimento generalbass or thoroughbass of the German style, and then there's also the French thoroughbass tradition? Do they have overlap? Are they similar in great regards, or are they very distinct in certain areas?
They are certainly overlapping. The French call basse continuo accompaniment. And that's exactly what it is, actually. It's the accompaniment of a melody played by a flute or something like that. So basse continuo, a thorough bass, is always a sort of intended for the accompaniment of a melody voice. Partimento, on the contrary, actually aims to be a complete composition. Of course, a prefab composition, but you should, as a 14-year-old pupil at the Neapolitan Conservatory, you should be able to realize a bass with your right hand in order to make something like an aria or an invention or a little sonata or something like that. So the aims are a little bit more extended than just working out continuo. Now, your second part of your question was about the Handel thorough bass exercises or the Langlois, but actually I would also call Handel's exercises also partimenti. Perhaps he didn't call it like that, but there are fugues involved, and the exercise that he is giving, as simple as they are, they can lead to nice realizations. And the Langlois manuscript actually in the same way.
I get the impression that thoroughbass, as Bach practiced it with a capital T, is kind of like partimento in the sense that it leads you through thoroughbass fugues, and it is kind of like a partimento course in a way. Because according to him, thoroughbass was everything. So it was that really important core to his method. And is that... So I noticed there's a lot of success in the Schola Cantorum and all conservatories in Europe that are practicing a thoroughbass renaissance in a way. And is that kind of like partimento, or is that basically like partimento with a small p? It is kind of a significant overlap in methodology.
There's a big overlap, I think, yes. And partimento, of course, is a bit constrained to the Italian sources. And it is just that the Italians called it partimento, but if you look at the Langlois manuscript, for instance, and you look at those preludes and fugues, and you just think, of course, for instance, Niccolo Sala as one of the authors, then they will be partimenti. Sala wasn't the author of those exercises, but it's also perhaps partly a matter of language.
Privately, I've asked many brilliant scholars about partimento and schema, and I was surprised that actually some of them, when they told me that when they taught partimento, some of them wouldn't really teach music schemata, like Quicenza and Meyer and that sort of thing, because they're very, I guess you could say they're very focused on historically being like what the Neapolitans would have done. So just trying to be as close to that as possible. And on the flip side, some scholars use schema with tremendous success, because we know there's so many great musicians, and they improvise, and they using schema in a fantastic way. Can you talk about schema and partimento with a capital P, the Italian tradition? So how do you balance that? Can you discuss that different approaches and the usages of schema and partimento?
Yes. The point is that the terms coined by Gjerdingen are, of course, partly at least fantasy terms, like a quiescenza. That's not a term known by the Neapolitans, of course. But see it as something non-verbal. And so we call it quiescenza just to know where we are talking about. But the Neapolitans, at least as I imagine, they just did it and they had a sort of idea in their mind without giving it a name. And the danger of using those terms, actually I do it, but the danger of that is that you are going to see them as a sort of building blocks. And if you read Gjerdingen's book, Music in the Galant Style, carefully, then you will learn that for him a schema is much more a sort of, what he is calling a mental representation of something. So it's something that happens in the mind of a composer or a listener or a performer. So imagine a child in, let's say, 1750 or so. Mostly he in Naples, of course, would never have learned a printer, for instance, as something that you could use with a beginning and an end. But he, just by doing it many, many times, he acquired some sort of non-verbal knowledge of patterns like that. And he learned it actually in many different ways. So if I learn I teach my students in a printer, then I would first of all perhaps say, now listen to the Alleluia of Handel or so. And then you have a sort of blueprint of it. But my first example would be something like this here. Yeah, so that is a printer. But I don't think that the Neapolitans started with that and then decorated it, but they learned the printer. Of course, they didn't know the term, but they learned this sort of idea just as a sort of result of many forms of it. So, for instance, if I play this here, then we all hear, of course, the connection between the two, the simple and the more decorated one. But perhaps for those little boys, these were just two different things. And if you do something like this here, then we still hear another decoration of the printer. But for a young pianist, for instance, they would be three different things. And my hypothesis is that by doing these sort of variants all the time, then there becomes a pupil gets a sort of idea of a collection of utterances with some similarities. For instance, a bass, a fa mi re do, or 4-3-2-1, on which you can vary with your right hand in all different ways, but mostly with a sort of parallel motion. This is just one example, but so coming back to my earlier remark that the danger is a little bit that we learn our students just those things as building blocks, while in the experience of 18th century pupils, it was something that grew with time by doing it over and over and over again. And now in my book, I'm of course not going to criticize my book, but for instance, in section 5.1 or so, I'm discussing the Romanesca. And in 5.2, the Fenaroli. And I don't think that was the way how it was taught in the 18th century. But it's perhaps good to say that my book is not an old method. It's the subtitle is A New Method inspired by old masters. Huh?
Let me turn to the topic of hexachordal 18th century Italian solfeggio. And now
yes.
I understand that you have collaborated with Nicholas Baragwanath on this. So from the beginning,
Yes,
how did you find out about it? Can you describe when you started implementing it and the results of your using it with students and yourself?
Now, the first time that I met Nicholas Baragwanath, was at a Congress in Leuven in 2014, Leuven in Belgium. And but I already did hexachord singing many years before, but not in the way Nicholas presented it, but just in the old medieval way. And I did a lot of hexachordal singing. It was Renaissance pieces with my students. And so I had some experience with that already. Then Nicholas came with his reconstruction of Italian solfeggio. And for me, that was a sort of aha-erlebnis. So he talked about that, and I was immediately interested because of that. And I remember that the first time that he presented this subject here, I didn't understand anything of it, because it was totally different from what I always did with just the more traditional hexachord singing. But perhaps one word about the old methods of hexachords. So when you, for instance, approach, let's say, a mass of Josquin or a motet of Palestrina or other 16th century composers, we know that the way how musicians or singers, mostly, of course, in the 16th century, learned music was by means of hexachords. So the first lesson was not in music notation as it is in our world and our time, but they was just singing plain chant, I suppose, in church schools, and they learned that by means of the old Guidonian hand and the method. So they learned as a basis a relative way of singing. So not in pitches, but in tone relations. And it was all circling around the mi-fa. And it's a wonderful method. Just if you know where the mi-fa is, you can sing everything. That's the idea behind hexachordal singing. And the other way is that so we are so trained in thinking in terms of octaves. This D is the same as this here and that and that. But I think that's not true. At least not in 16th century repertoire, because they all thought in terms of hexachords. And when you are listening to melodies from the 16th century, so often the hexachords are the framework of the melodies. And of course, you can mutate so that the range of your melody is much more than a hexachord, but you always feel a sort of choice of that. So when that a melody is really moving into another region. And I don't know how to explain that other than in terms of hexachords. And I think that's the conceptual framework of 16th century singers and composers. So I think it's really important to go back to that system of hexachords.
Now, you mentioned Nicholas Baragwanath's reconstruction of the 18th century. Now, you had experience with the 16th century. What was the jump then to the 18th century?
Yes, that was, of course, a different world because the old Guidonian hexachord system was really different from the 18th century Italian methods. But of course, there were also similarities. For instance, the thinking in terms of hexachords and mutation and other things. But it is in the 18th century, it became really a transposable system, in which the keys were the departing points, and actually all scales were now just scales based on a combination of hexachords. So, for instance, do, re, mi, fa, so, re, mi, fa, mi, la, so, fa, mi, re, do. That was a scale as the Italians sang it. And that's quite fixed, and you could transpose it to all keys.
And I noticed coming down was different from going up.
Yes, sure, yeah. So there was a rule of how you had to mutate But another point is that I started to train my students in solfeggio classes in a movable dose system, the so-called Kodai system.
From Hungary, is that right?
From Hungary, yes, or actually, it was based on English methods.
Okay.
Nothing Hungary of that, but it became known as the Kodai system.
Okay.
And it is much more than just relative dose singing or so.
So you're saying the hexachordal is different from the movable do?
It has overlaps, and there are also differences. But I went to Hungary several times with one of my colleagues, and we learned that method from great teachers over there. And we came back and we tried to implement those methods in our own classes.
And you're talking about the movable do, and that is a change from the fixed do, which is more common.
Yeah, now in the Netherlands, we never teach solfeggio in fixed do, but we use some numbers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But actually, those different experiences from hexachordal singing and the Kodai system made me really interested in the 18th century method of Nicholas, as Nicholas presented. So therefore, I immediately was in. Now we have met several times, and in the last 2 years quite often actually. He came to Amsterdam. We saw each other on congresses, and we have a lot of contact by email. Now we are working on classes in Italian solfeggio. And we have a lot of discussions about that.
It's very new. Everyone is excited about it. I want to plug Nicholas Baragwanath's excellent book. It's The Solfeggio Tradition. It was just released, and his Facebook group, The Art of Solfeggio. People are hungering for more pedagogy, more exercises, more instructions, more resources. You are one of the few practitioners, in addition to Professor Baragwanath, who use this form of the 18th century Italian method. How should somebody learn it?
Yeah, now at this very moment I have two groups. One with early music students, and it's part of a bigger course that I call Historical Solfeggio. And in the first semester we trained in hexachordal solmization from 16th century sources. And so they are already trained in mutation, solmization, relative singing. And so it was not a very big step into the 18th century world. Of course, there are differences, but they could understand it quite well. And what I say to them, this is not a sight reading course. So the Italian solfeggio is not meant to be a better sight reader. Then you can better take another solfeggio class or so. But don't join this class here. This is much more going into the depths of musical understanding in at least an 18th century repertoire. But you can also apply it, to, I think, Corelli, late 17th century or so. So it is about understanding patterns in melody. And it's also something that makes you learn to improvise on simple patterns. So the way how you can... I remember that, so you had a conversation with Nicholas, I think 1 year ago, and he told something about how to make a sonata exposition from simple patterns. And he did something like, now start with fa, mi, fa, and then la, sol, fa, mi. And then he sung or played something like this here. Yeah, so fa, fa, mi, fa, and la, sol, fa, mi. Yeah? And just by combining a few of those simple patterns, just containing 3 or 4 solmization syllables, perhaps divided over 2 different hexachords, then you can make the most beautiful music.
That's really so fascinating. I have so many questions on this regard. The first question really quickly is, how do you know when you've really mutated to the other hexachord? Is it black and white, so simple to understand, or is it kind of a gray area? I think I should change the syllable here, or no, you definitely should change it here, and it's set. Everyone would agree this is the right place to change the syllable.
No, it's somewhere in the middle. I would say it's sometimes quite black-white, but there is space for discussion, and Nicholas and I had discussions about that. So where should you mutate, and is this a ray, or is it perhaps better to call it a sol, or whatever? But there are some simple rules, you might say. But it's always a matter of interpretation. So it's also the way how you can combine different notes in one a syllable, for instance. So what the example that I gave, fa, mi, fa. Yeah, so that's, of course, you can perhaps do it in different ways, but that's a way how you can show.
Is that related to the beats, the strong beats because I've seen in his book that you can stretch out one syllable for an incredible number of notes. Yeah. And is that also black and white? Do you know clearly when it's the end of the diminution and that's the end of the melisma, and then you have the next syllable? Is that very easy to understand?
No, that's a very good question. The point is that the choice of your syllables depends on many things. You said something about the metrical aspects. So is the first beat or a weak part of the bar? Another thing, is it a harmonic note or not? Is it part of a new harmony? That could be a sign to change your syllable. But there are a lot of considerations that you can have, and so it's difficult to say something about it in general. You have to look at it from solfeggio to solfeggio, and sometimes the authors of those solfeggi give some little hints to the performers by means of traits. So sort of slur. They look like slurs, but a bit flattened. And that shows that you have to take more than one note in one syllable. And sometimes they only do that on places where you would expect something different. And then a trait, so that's almost slur, so to speak, tells you to do something different from what you would do with your intuition. So the answer of that is, there are sometimes more than one interpretations.
I'm taking partimento lessons and I really enjoy them. I'm having a good time.
Wonderful.
Ewald de Meyere. And one thing is, when I see in an accidental in the bass line, I think to myself, that is 99% of the time a leading note of the new key. Now, the thing is with the solfeggio, do I have to think, okay, now I see an accidental in the bass, okay, now I have to think of two new hexachords in the new key, and then so I'm not thinking of mutation, I'm actually thinking of a modulation to a different key, and then does that change all the syllables as well?
Yes, so of course a sharp can just be a chromatic note or so, but if it changes the tonality, then you have to shift your whole system, your two hexachord systems actually, toward that new key. And that's quite well described in Italian sources that are quite rare actually, but it is about changing a mi into a fa or a fa into a mi. So if you take the EF in the key of C major as an example, then the F is a fa. And if you raise that into a F sharp and it becomes a new key of G major, then actually you have changed the fa into a mi, because then the F sharp is a mi in the new key of G major. And when you go back, so the C that goes to B in C major, then you sing fa mi. But now if you make a B flat of the B natural, then it becomes fa fa. And then the B flat is a fa. And then you go down in the circle of fifths to F major.
Do you use the original names of the keys, or would you still say C major today?
No, yes, I do that. I tell my students how the Italians mention those keys just for sake of information. But we just talk about C major or whatever.
Right, right. So the question is now, in the practical case of the singing, do you find there's no problem if you see accidentals and if you look at a solfeggi for the first time without any syllables, you can kind of navigate your way through in real time, and it's doable, just like in the same way a partimento is doable if you get used to it?
Yes, but I don't think it's the aim of doing that, because what I said, it's not something that has to do with sight reading. So it invites you to study, to really understand the music. And I don't bother to think 1 hour for one solfeggio, or for instance Cotomachi or Leonardo Leo. They are so beautiful, and it's really wonderful to look at them and to try to understand. So in a usual solfeggio class, you take a book with solfeggio exercises, and you do 10 solfeggi in 1 hour class or so, and each student has done one. But here in a class Italian solfeggio, I just take one. And that's a whole lesson. And there are so many things that we can study and can practice. And at the end of the lesson, you might say, then we sing the whole solfeggio as is notated by. I'm now just working on some solfeggi by Cotomachi, Carlo Cotomachi, in the time of Carl Philipp and Manuel Bach. And they were written around 1750, and they are so beautiful. When you are playing a Mozart sonata, you also don't need to do that in just 5 minutes, but you can take a week for studying that.
And then that's what you mean by really internalizing the music and absorbing it, so that
absolutely
you really listen to it and you understand what is because it is a pedagogical, but not for what people think. It's actually to get deeper into the music, is what you're saying.
Now, there was a very nice remark of my student that comes just into my mind now, and he told me that this was changing his life. And
I'm hearing that a lot. Yeah,
at least his musical life. And I think that's the best feedback that you can get, of course, from your.
I changed my life.
He meant it in a positive way, by the way. But yeah.
What is the best way to learn partimento?
Now, I would say if you don't have experience in that, then I would say buy my book. Because I think that at least the first 5 chapters, if you read them, that will be a nice introduction to the easier partimenti by Fenaroli and Durante and others. You need some experience before you start with those partimenti in understanding the patterns. And of course, each partimento book or each partimento collection has its own so-called regole, or at least many of them, in which very shortly some important issues are explained, not in words, but just in note examples. But I think for a non-experienced starter, that will be too concise to immediately learn the idea behind it. So I think that at least you need a teacher who is experienced, who is telling you what to do or perhaps what better not, and to give you feedback. I think that my book could be of help for doing that, because it shows the exercises that you can start from the very, very beginning. And I think that if you start with a scale in parallel thirds, as my first exercise does, everybody can do that. At least you have to be able to play a scale, of course, but not so much more than that. And the wonderful thing is that I was just analyzing the A major piano concerto of Mozart, 488, wonderful piece, by the way. And the third movement of that concert is full with passages really based on parallel thirds or parallel tenths, decorated in different ways. And so wonderful. It's a very simple scheme, and it is one of the main patterns in that third movement of 4-8-8. It's incredible. So I think that would be a good start. And what I already showed you before, you can do wonderful things with that. So think of that simple partimento of Durante. A little bit later, when we are going to talk about three-part harmony of harmony counterpoint, then there's one exercise in I think it's in chapter 2, which is almost a complete trio sonata by Corelli. And I only left out one thing I remember, which would be too early in the method, but it's just actually a wonderful piece. It's Corelli, and you can do that with 2 months of practice. And Corelli trio sonata could be a wonderful realization of a partimento. It is not a partimento, but it could have been one. So step by, I think that was the reason why I started to write the book. That it was actually impossible for our students to immediately jump into the partimento world.
Because, as you mentioned in the book, there's quite a jump in skill required. Like you mentioned, the keyboard skills, but also you need to know a lot of things before you can actually do it. So what you're suggesting in the book is a lot of great stepwise things you can do to build up and to get into the music quickly.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Do you mind if I show you a little bit of that?
Yes, of course, absolutely.
Yeah. So that is so what they learned before making that. Things like this here, etc. We call that the monte, in which 5/3 chords and 6/3 chords are alternating, and the other way around. That is what I call the 7/6 faux bourdon, based on a dissonant treatment. And we had some other patterns comparable with that. And think of, let's say, lesson or 7 or 8. So in November in the first year. And this is an exercise that my students did. It sounds like this here. It's Corelli. This phase is repeated and then etc. etc. So this is, I think this is quite good music. And but this if you would only have the bass, then you would say this is a perfect partimento.
What's the best way to learn counterpoint?
Yes, that's a good point. It's so difficult to read it to learn it from a book or so. It's like piano playing. I can explain how you have to play piano in 20 minutes, but that doesn't mean that you can play piano then. So so one of my favorite courses is teaching counterpoint actually, and we start with actually the same sort of exercise, but then much more in a modal style. And before you approach some sort of level in which you can, let's say, write.
Should written counterpoint come after you've sung a lot and played a lot, or is it okay to start counterpoint right away?
Now, I think that if there is one thing that you need to know or to be able to do is to sing. The nice thing of counterpoint teaching is, at least in modal style, that your prior knowledge need to be sort of zero. And so you start with just a simple melody, and but you need to be able to sing. Because if you can't, then you don't feel a melody, because that is something that you cannot explain that. So if you start creating a melody in actually whatever style, but also Renaissance style, then you at least need to understand intuitively something about melody. So you can do it without many skills, but a little singing would be really needed.
And I interrupted you just now. You were actually explaining the way you would teach counterpoint.
Yeah, what I said, I'm following a sort of historical method, and actually when you go back to the earliest counterpoint treatises, for instance, Johannes Tinctoris and the end of the 15th century, then you see that they had a very strong emphasis on starting with just two parts and only with consonant intervals without using any rhythm. Now, in the species counterpoint of Fuchs and of modern textbooks, it is the first species in the method. But that was how everybody was starting. But it was also the starting point for improvisation. So you had to control the consonances, and in between those consonances you could improvise, etc., etc. You might say you could start to diminish, starting from very simple two-part harmonies. You started to diminish or to decorate your melodies, and then you could use shorter note values. Let's say if we start with whole notes, then you can add half notes, quarter notes, and ties, etc. And that's actually the way how it is always taught, and that eventually led to Fuchs' method in the 18th century, but never so how do you say that? Not so strongly as a system as Fuchs has presented it. So much freer actually. And so that's what I'm doing too.
Right. And does that lead into 18th century counterpoint, 19th century counterpoint as well?
Yeah, ideally speaking, it should. But in music institutions, mostly it is one discipline, Renaissance counterpoint, and the other is Baroque. And it doesn't lead automatically from one to the other. But what I just said in the beginning of our conversation, when I was writing my book, I really needed all those skills of Renaissance counterpoint actually, because that's the basis of our musical language. I couldn't do without. So when I was giving 18th century examples, I needed the skills of Renaissance counterpoint actually.
You start off the book with two voices, harmony in 2 and 3 parts. Then you move on to part 2, which is harmony in 4 parts. Sometimes, like Bach, for instance, or Fenaroli, sometimes in the partimento, they start with 4 voice or more. But some teachers also start with 2 voices and they go outwards into more voices. Some teachers go from lots of voices, and then for them it's more difficult to pare down to lower voices. So what is your perspective on the number of voices when learning music?
For me, it was a very, very difficult question how I should start with 4-part harmony. Because when you work on 2 parts, then you can always hear those 2 parts at the same time. And so I think that everybody with a sort of musical apt can distinguish the 2 voices. And when you add a middle voice in 3-part harmony or counterpoint, then you can still hear the middle voice quite well. At the very moment that you start writing or singing 4-part harmony, be it in the chorale of Bach or whatever, it becomes so much more difficult because those 2 middle voices are blending and you hear 2 outer voices and something in the middle. And for me, it was really a sort of headache point of how to introduce 4-part harmony without losing the sight on linear working. And actually, I got an idea when I was just looking at a very simple Fenaroli partimento that I'm going to play for you the first couple of bars.
Yes, please.
The partimento is doing this here. That's the beginning. So in terms of Bob Gjerdingen, it starts with a boring figure and then it follows with an exciting figure. And that always means that you have to combine things. So the exciting and the boring. And that leads automatically to this here. Yeah? So that is just something that the bass speaks to you and tells you this is what you should do. And that's so there's almost no choice. But if you hear this here, then perhaps you recognize a little piece like this here. Etc. Yeah? So this is Bach, and this was one of my favorite preludes when I was 9 years old or so. So when I saw this partimento by Fenaroli, I said, yeah, but this is wonderful. And the point is that here in the Bach piece, there's a mixture of, it starts with one voice, and then we have 4-part harmony, and then you have 2-part harmony, 3-part harmony, and it's almost a sort of solo concerto with a ritornello and solo passages. And I thought, wow, this is the good choice. So we start with 4-part harmony, but we mix it with 2-part and 3-part harmony or counterpoint. So we just take out a few patterns, starting with a cadence, like I played here, and everything around it is still in 2 or 3 parts. So that we don't completely, let's say, quit the whole idea of 3-part listening, 3-part counterpoint. And for me, that was the key to start with the second part of the book. And I remember that I was thinking about that for months, and I couldn't. It was really a sort of, blockade.
I guess now my final question is, you have experience not just with Renaissance in the 18th century, but you, in your articles and in your work, you have talked about subjects like the Second Viennese School, and you've really covered the gamut in terms of the tonal languages. So my question is, can partimento, because you obviously have applied schema theory in your research to the common practice period, but schema and partimento are not necessarily exactly the same thing. Is partimento the same, useful in applying it in the Romantic or even later, Debussy, Ravel, Rachmaninoff, Stravinsky? Is that useful, partimento? Do you find that knowledge of partimento is useful for later common practice music?
Yeah, the partimento of the 18th century is perhaps not so much applicable to later genres or later styles. But as Gjerdingen describes wonderfully in his book Child Composers and the Old Conservatories, there you see that actually the Neapolitan methods from the 18th century were taken over by the Paris Conservatory. And you see that now it is as if all harmony teachers over there, which was a really important subject at the conservatory in the 19th century, they all wrote their own harmony books. Traité de l'harmonie, almost always the title of those books. And they show much more a 19th century style in their exercises and their examples. But they still use sometimes the partimenti from the 18th century, so still in value in the 19th century, but they also wrote a lot of other partimenti more up-to-date in style, actually. And when you look at contests, for instance, in harmony or in counterpoint in France, in Paris, for instance, by Claude Debussy, it really goes beyond the 18th century language of harmony. But perhaps also nice to say that Giuseppe Verdi worked through all the 6 books of Fedele Fenaroli. And that was a set of partimenti published in 1775. And even Luciano Berio, he got the 6 books by for his grandfather when he was 5 years old, I think. And he told that he worked through all of them. and that it was of great help for his own composing start. So if you take those confessions seriously, then you would say then yes, indeed, for all styles, because you learn about harmony, about linearity, about rhythm, and that is something universal, I think.
Well, what a great conversation with a leading expert in the field of partimento, Professor Job IJzerman. I highly recommend you check out his book, Harmony, Counterpoint, Partimento, published in 2018 by Oxford University Press. In addition to the book, it comes with a companion website containing the workbook, realizations of all the exercises, the teacher's manual, and MP3 files of all the textbook examples. Professor IJzerman, what is the plan for 2021 for you?
Now, first of all, we have to set out the corona crisis. I'm in my last years of my career, so I've done a lot of experience in my life, and I actually I wouldn't mind just to enjoy the results of those.
To relax.
But I'm always thinking, and it never stops, actually. So actually, I'm not looking forward to my retirement, I can tell you, because I'm full with ideas, but making things better. Yeah, that's my intention.
Well, Thank you so much for coming on the show. I hope you had a good time. And
yes, Nikhil, it was a very great pleasure to talk with you. Thank you very much.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.